Okay, here we are. So welcome back. This is the second of our series of video lectures on Karl Marx's Das Kapital. Now, briefly again, as I mentioned in the last video, this is not meant to be a definitive presentation of Marx's work, much less even just Das Kapital alone. Das Kapital is an extremely lengthy work. Between all three volumes, it comprises roughly 3,000 pages. Ballparked. Anyway, it's ridiculously huge. So what we are doing in this series of lectures is hitting on some of the critical components of Das Kapital, with an emphasis particularly on the more technical aspects of the work. That is the specific economic modeling and explanation, formal explanation within Marx's work. Okay, so let's hop into that. So the theoretical structure of Das Kapital is really founded upon the classical economics that we've studied in previous video lectures, most notably the work of David Ricardo. Well, hang on, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So here's what we're going to cover in this one, right? So we're going to cover the technical details in the model. Yeah, okay. All right, so let's make this window a little smaller. Okay, I'll make myself bigger in a few minutes, but so it's origins of Marx's economic model. So some things that are notably different from Marx's predecessors that are worth noting. First of all, you're going to notice that there's a lot more detail in this model when compared to, say, Ricardo's so-called Korn model. It's much more sophisticated, right? It's roughly 40 years later, and a lot of work has been done in economics, and Marx reflects a lot of that work as well as adds a bunch of his own, right? So, for example, when we studied Mill, we saw how the labor theory of value was already kind of starting to break down a little bit in Mill. We're going to see that the labor theory of value in Marx is much more nuanced than, say, in Ricardo or other earlier classical economists. It doesn't directly explain prices. So, the idea that price that takes twice as much time or an item that takes twice as much labor time to produce as another should cost twice as much or will cost twice as much in the marketplace. That's just not how Marx works, right? And so we'll see that, right? Other differences, right? There's no subsistence theory of wages in Marx. Marx gets rid of that and replaces it with a theory of unemployment, which we'll see. Not so much in this one, but in the next video lecture. And Marx's treatment of capital, as one would expect with a book named Das Kapital, is more nuanced and sophisticated than the classical predecessors. Returns to land, it's not a simple unearned increment like it was earlier, particularly in the Ricardian Korn model. And there's a variety of other little tweaks. Another tweak is that where the Ricardian system sort of runs one time, right? Sort of a farm that starts in the spring and ends in the fall, and then repeats each time sort of over and over again. It's a little machine that turns over once annually. Marx's little classical machine, his little model, is going to allow for different rates of turnover. That the little machine can sort of start and stop faster or slower, you name it, and that's going to have implications for the outcomes of the model. Okay, so let's go through the variables of Marx's model. So in all of this, in all of our presentation here on Marx, uppercase variables will denote stocks and lowercase variables will denote flows. So for those of you watching this aren't familiar with those terms, stocks and flows, economists use the idea of flow to move. Flow concept is an economic value that's in motion, right? So like income, for example, is a flow. It's a flow from payment from one individual to another. And it's in the case of income, it's a return for providing some factor of production in the market, right? A stock concept is a value not in motion. So, for example, the value of your checking account, that's not in flow, right? It's just sort of sitting there. And so that's a stock concept. Okay. Now you may spend out of your checking account. That's a flow. You may deposit into your checking account. That's a flow. But the value of your checking account at a given point in time is a stock concept. So again, flow, lowercase, stock, uppercase. So let's walk through these because there's quite a lot here, right? You're already seeing, oh my gosh, there's a lot more little details in Marx's model when compared to, say, Ricardo's. Okay. So lowercase c is constant capital. So what is this? This is the sum of payments, right? So their flow concept, right? The sum of payments, depreciation on fixed capital and other inputs. So you can imagine, machinery is wearing out or requires maintenance every time it's used, or every month, or every 6 months, or whatever. We'll talk about those time periods a little later. It requires that payment, right? And that payment actually can't be adjusted. It's non-negotiable. The machine requires a quart of oil. You can't give it a half a quart. All right. V, lowercase v, is the flow of wage payments. So Marx calls this variable capital. So constant capital is the outlay needed to maintain machinery and other inputs to production. So what might these other things be? Well, like the software that I'm using right now, costs money. Okay. V is particularly the labor costs, and then the sum of C and V, it gives us K, or lowercase k, or the total flow of capital outlays in a given period. Okay. So we can think of those ideas as cost conditions, right? As flow cost conditions. T subscript C and T subscript V are the rate of turnover of C and V. Okay, so you can think of this as a stock of capital, uppercase C over lowercase c, or the stock of variable capital over flow of variable capital. And maybe the easiest way of thinking about this is to understand turnover as the number of times the machine goes, right? So we think of this model as a little machine. How many times does the machine turn over in a given period of time, right? So in the Ricardian model, it was a sort of simple egg model where it started in the spring, ended in the fall, and started next spring, right? So if we were thinking about T as being an annual amount, then it would be 1, right? Okay, if T were a decade, then in the Ricardian model, then, if the period of time we wanted to consider was a decade, then T would be 10, okay? All right, so, if this was a monthly value in an annual, it'd be 12, right? Okay, so how many times in a given period of time does the machine sort of turn over? All right, D, C, and DV are the durability, how many years those things last, right? So you can see that T and D are going to give us, as well as C and V are going to give us ideas about how often these payments need to be made to constant and variable capital, as well as how long these items sort of last, right? All right. S then is an important concept in Marx. It's surplus value. And what we mean by surplus, or what Marx meant by surplus value, is the gross receipts of the firm. So you can think of it as all the revenues that the firm they take in over their fixed and variable costs. So what is it? It's a ratio of receipts to cost, right? So you might say, well, that sounds kind of like profit. Well, yes, it is similar, but it's not the same, okay? Which brings us to profit. Okay, so what is profit? Well, if we make T equal to 1, again, rate of turnover, so we simplify a little bit, then the rate of profit is just S over K, okay? All right, so S over K. In other words, the surplus value over K, which is total outlays. So surplus value is, the rate of profit. The rate of profit is the surplus value expressed relative to your cost of production. In other words, your surplus value is determinant along with costs of the rate of profit. Okay. Another important concept in Marx that's kind of unique is the Q, the organic composition of capital. Now, by now too, right, if you're getting like, oh my gosh, all these terms like constant capital, variable capital, surplus value, organic, yeah, okay, so here's the thing that makes Marx really hard is he has his own terminology. It's not easy to understand, quite frankly, and it really makes the non-well-informed reader, it makes it a very opaque set of ideas to really dig into. Okay, so please bear with me. Once you sort of demystify it, or if you sort of change the language into modern terminology or simple mathematical terminology, it's still difficult, but it's a heck of a lot easier to pull apart. Okay, so I shouldn't say pull apart, but to decipher what's going on. Okay, so Q is the organic composition of capital, and what this is essentially the capital to labor ratio intensity. Okay, so it tells us, production uses what share of capital to labor, in particular with the stock of capital to the flow of variable labor costs, or uppercase C over lowercase v. All right, last thing here, right? Sigma. Okay, the rate of surplus value. So this is the rate of surplus value to variable expenses, or S over V. Okay, so rate of surplus value. So what that last one is an important concept because it effectively gives you the rate of exploitation. Okay, so as that ratio rises, S over V, what you're doing is you're getting more value out of labor compared to what you're paying them. Okay, we'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, welcome back. So now that we've gone through the list of the basic variables associated with Marx's model, let's start building. Let's start discussing some of the other relationships that we'll need to be aware of to understand what's sort of the story is here, right? So if we think about that variable c, lowercase c, that is, as sort of the per period payment to constant capital in this case, or machinery and other equipment that needs to be made to sort of keep the machine running, as you were. So like depreciation charges, other maintenance charges, things like that. And we express that as a ratio to the number of times that it turns over, or the machine turns over. Then we have an expression of uppercase C, or the stock of constant capital. Right, so that's available in production. Similarly, lowercase v over TV gives stock of variable capital, and just kind of understand sort of what this is all about. Recall the sort of wages fund doctrine from Mill or from Ricardo or any of those. This v over TV is essentially the essentially the same idea. It's the pool of funds available for wages, right? So here we can sort of see some of the additional nuance that Marx is bringing into this, which is actually going to end up causing him a lot of problems, as we'll see in the next video lecture. But rather than sort of thinking about the machine spitting out a constant KL like it does in Ricardo, here we have sort of dual paths for things to sort of go along as this accumulation process continues. Uppercase C plus V then gives us the stock of capital invested, right? So this is the total amount of capital poured into the machine in a given period, right? And then finally, the more elaborate expression for the rate of profit, where if we have multiple turnover periods, right? So if the machine runs more than once, right, then each time the machine turns over, it turns over the rate S over C plus V as a rate of profit, or surplus value expressed relative to flows of outgoing costs, right? And if the machine turns over many times, right, then essentially every time the machine turns over, you extract some surplus value, or there's some value created that isn't paid out either to the machine in the form of maintenance costs or things like that. It isn't paid out to the workers, right? So each time that machine turns over, you get that extraction of surplus value, which of course contributes in a positive manner to the overall rate of profit. Okay. Yes. Okay. So several other things to note before we wrap it up this time. Right. First is that in Marxian economics, we assume that markets are competitive. This may come as a surprise to folks, as we normally think about. I think Marx and like power sort of go hand in hand and things like that. But Marxian economics, as constructed by Marx originally, is a competitive process. That is to say that Marx is not only aware but fully recognizes that there's a process by which prices equalize across, say, businesses or across industries, and that it's competition that does that, right? Okay. Now, there are 20th century sort of Marxist revisionists or revisionists of Marx works who have attempted to reconstruct Marx using 20th century monopoly style models. This is unsurprisingly known as the monopoly capital school. So if you see that's what that's all about. It's an attempt to reconstruct Marx along monopoly lines or sort of modern orthodox, I shouldn't say orthodox, right, but more modern theoretical ideas rather than using these Ricardian ideas we have here. Okay, so this implies that labor time must be paid the time necessary to put into it. So if a given job requires a certain amount of training and that takes time, then the labor is going to have to be compensated for that somehow, some way, shape, or form, and this is a recognition of that. There's also, I mentioned this a moment ago, but also we should understand that labor can produce more value than it earns in Marx. So we can think of labor as requiring that it is paid what it needs to replicate itself, right? So if we think about training costs and all that, it has to be compensated for that, or it would cease to exist, right? But labor power, right? So you bring the worker, you pay them what they need to be paid to recreate themselves, and they come into work, right? And Marx allows for them to produce more value for the workplace than they're required to be compensated, okay, to keep themselves going. Now, in the cases where labor produces more value than it earns, we call that's exploitation in Marxian terminology. Now, it's worth noting that it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that labor is exploited, right? So all conditions don't necessarily lead you to that conclusion, but that in general, this would likely be the case, right? Sorry. So in general, though, however, the rate of exploitation is going to matter quite a bit, and so we'll see that again in the next video. Next thing to note is that machinery cannot be exploited. Okay, so whereas labor can be paid less than the value that it creates, machinery cannot. So machinery, if it takes a half a quart of oil to keep the machine going, and a half a quart requires, it costs, just to take some money figure, $3 or whatever, you can't give it $2 worth of oil. You have to give it $3. Okay. So the rate at which labor is exploited is referred to as the rate of surplus value. So it's that idea is going to matter quite a bit. Okay, so we should have at this point some idea about sort of the working pieces of Marx's model. Okay, everybody, so that's it for this time. In the next video, which I promise will be a little more exciting, we'll see how this little machine works. This nice little model that Marx is developing here. So we hope you all return for that, and well, we'll see you then. Take care.